scary or creepy? To me, those are two very different things. I'll share both stories with you. Several years ago, I loaded a bunch of camping gear onto my bicycle and spent the better part of the next 7 months riding 5,300 miles, 8,500 kilometers around the western U.S. solo. At night, I most often preferred to wild camp. Rather than paying to sleep on the ground in a campground, I would just find somewhere to disappear into the woods, somewhere people were unlikely to find me and even less likely to care that I was there. The forest, I quickly learned, makes for far from a quiet night's sleep. After the first few weeks of this lifestyle, I had come to find comfort in the droning of thousands of crickets and toads. It was always a highlight of my night, though not particularly uncommon, to hear the yips and howls of a distant pack of coyotes. And I fondly recall one night when I was lulled to sleep by 2 owls, one on either end of my tent, hooting back and forth. If nothing else, it wouldn't take much of a breeze to stir music from the tree canopies. A bit over a month into the trip, I was way out in the middle of nowhere in western Montana. After a full day of cycling on incredibly sparse roads, I found somewhere to set up camp for the night. Went through my usual bedtime routine, pitch the tent, eat dinner, write my final journal entry of the day's events, study maps for the coming days, living outdoors all day every day. My sleep schedule more or less synced with the sun, and so I laid down in bed shortly after dusk. That's when I made a disturbing observation. There was not a single cricket chirping nor toad croaking, certainly no owls. There wasn't even the slightest breeze to rustle the dry leaves of early autumn still clinging to the trees. It was truly and completely silent, and that was terrifying. I can only describe it as the loudest silence I've ever felt. It was as if the entire forest was hiding from an equally silent predator. Suddenly, the occasional snapping of a twig, a common sound normally lost in the cacophony, rang out like a gunshot. I slept terribly that night, and I'll never forget the immense relief I felt with the first bird song of the pre-dawn hour. So that was my creepiest night. What about actual fear for my safety and well-being? That came a month or so later on the same trip. I was somewhere in southern Washington state with my sights set on Portland, Oregon. Again, I was just wild, camping in the woods. And I started coming down with food poisoning. I spent the whole night tossing and turning and leaning out the door of the tent to vomit. I'd finally throw up, then use some water from one of my bottles to rinse out my mouth. Drink some water to help replenish the fluids I'd lost, then lay back down. Feeling better, I'd get a couple hours sleep before waking up once again feeling nauseous. Come 4 a.m., I dreaded the thought of getting back on the bike. I simply didn't have the energy for it. But what other option did I have? Just wait alone in the woods and pray I recover quickly? Besides, I'd used up all my water through the night. I had no choice but to get on the road. Looking at my maps, there was a town not too far away with a motel where I could put myself up for a night of proper rest. It would be 30 miles or 50 kilometers, a reasonable half day for me under ideal conditions. Right as the sun came up, it started raining, so I waited out the brief 20-minute storm in the tent. Rain stopped. I took down the tent, loaded up the bike, and hiked it back to the road. Get on, start pedaling. And something feels weird. It's a flat tire. Just my luck, right? But I had the tools, spare parts, and knowledge to fix it, so I get to work. In my, less than ideal mental state, it took far longer to fix than it had any right to. And the time it was back together and holding air, it had started raining again. No option other than to turn on my lights, put on my jacket, and just ride through it. The words overwhelming hopelessness don't feel big enough, but I don't know how else to summarize. Going back about a couple of decades or so, I was living in London and would make a hiking/camping trip every 6 or 8 weeks as a way to deal with living in the middle of the city. One time a friend asked to come along, so he and I went to the New Forest in the southwest of England. The New Forest isn't actually new at all, the same way New College of Oxford University is anything but new. It has some of the few areas of ancient forest left in the UK. We're walking around on all these well-managed pathways. When it got to mid-afternoon, we thought, let's head off the tracks, get into the actual woodland, and then find a spot to camp. I take a compass bearing, and we turn off the path and head directly into the woods, making our way through the trees and ferns. For around a mile, maybe I had the most curious sensation go through me. Stopped and turned to my buddy and said, "Listen." The forest had suddenly gone completely silent. No bird song, no sound at all, not even the leaves rustling in the breeze. I stood there for a moment, my hand on my buddy's shoulder, trying to figure out what was occurring. Eventually shrugged and decided whatever it was would just have to be. The sensation that went through me wasn't threatening, but more curious. A feeling of curiosity. About 200 or 300 yards further, we found an ideal spot for camp. A large clearing, broadly circular in shape, plenty of space to set up camp. Also a small fire. It was spring into the UKK, so safe to do. We put our tents together, then I dig a fire pit while my pal starts gathering wood. There are even some logs we can use for seats too, and pretty soon we have a really comfortable setup. Night draws in, the fire's going nicely. We get dinner down us, and out comes a bottle of Black Label. We're drinking and sharing stories and have completely forgotten anything about that curious feeling from earlier. Time goes on and we're getting tired, so call it a night. We stomp out the fire, pee on it and pour plenty of water on it, then threw a load of soil on it and kick it around to make sure it's out, then say goodnight, and we both go into our tents and get our heads down. It usually takes me a while to get to sleep the first couple of days camping, and maybe it was the whiskey, but I was out like a light the instant my head was down. The first time I woke up, I could hear yelling a man's voice from far away, far beyond the direction of my buddy's tent. I couldn't make out any words, the voice coming from far away, but I could tell from the tone that it wasn't distress. I don't know why I dismiss it as interesting, but nothing to worry about, but that's what I did, and I went right back to sleep. The second time I woke up, I could see a ball of bright white light shining through the material of my tent. It was slightly larger than a tennis ball, and in my estimation about 20 yards away on the opposite side of the clearing, and it traveled in a perfect line, in a perfectly flat, linear direction from left to right. It wasn't bobbing up and down like a torch being carried. It moved in a flat line, gliding. Again, that curious feeling went through me, and as I knew it was there, I sensed that it knew I was there. I reached for the zip of my tent to open it and take a look when a voice in my head said, "Don't look." It was the same experience as when you're a child and an adult warns you, don't touch something dangerous, not angry or scary, but a very clear warning to not do something. My hand froze, fingers on the zipper, and I'm looking at the ball of light shining through the tent lining. That feeling of curiosity in me. Go back to sleep, tears, said the voice in my head. Again, not scary, but very much an instruction. I immediately put my head back down and sleep literally pulled me in. It wasn't me falling asleep, so much as sleep reaching for me and pulling me in. When I open my eyes, it's daylight, so I open the zipper of my tent, and the campsite is as we left it. Nothing changed, nothing moved. I felt like I'd had the best night's sleep ever. I still do after all these years. Absolutely daisy, fresh, bright, alert, fully rested, and energized. The zip on my buddy's tent opens and his head sticks out. A big grin on his face. "Morning," he calls out. "Good morning," I reply. "How are you feeling?" "Great," he says, a big smile on his face. "Brilliant, in fact. I had an awesome night's sleep." "Me too, man," I said. "We went through a bottle of whiskey last night, and I don't feel hungover in the slightest." "Same here," he says with a big smile. "I feel perfectly fine. I think we got away with it, haha." We clamber out of our tents and get some water boiling to start a morning brew going, have some breakfast, and as we're breaking down camp, I ask him, "Did you see or hear anything weird during the night?" "Nope, I slept right through. Out the moment my head hit the pillow." "Really?" "There was something weird going on last night, mate," I tell him. "I could hear someone yelling out in the woods." "Wait, now you mention it." My buddy looked at me. "Yeah, I did hear someone shouting something. It was coming from that direction." He waved in the direction behind my tent. "I heard it coming from that direction," I said, and pointed beyond his tent. "Could you make out any words?" He shook his head and carried on taking down his tent. I thought to ask if he'd seen anything during the night, but decided not to. Seeing bright lights floating in the woods at night and hearing voices in your head isn't exactly sane sounding, so I let it go. We set off, and basically, that was that. We grabbed lunch at a pub, then back to the car, and drove back to London. I'm in my 50s now, and I've never experienced anything like that before or since, and it's still probably the best night's rest I've ever had. I briefly lived in Connecticut in a Navy housing area and had a lot of strange experiences for the 8 months I lived there. The biggest one was something that followed me when I moved back home to New Mexico. One night, some friends in the Navy housing I was living in were hanging out in their backyard, which was next to mine. I went outside to smoke, and they soon started calling me over to look at something. It was dusk, and for context, our yards were on a hill that sloped down to a thicket of trees. They were all pointing towards the trees and freaking out, so I looked over and saw what I could only really describe as a barely opaque, grayish-black shape, reminiscent of an oval, but it was hard to make out the edges of. It instantly stopped me in my tracks and gave me an unexplainable, urgent, ominous, and all-encompassing sense of fear, despair, anger, and impending doom. The shape was larger than a human and way too weird to be any animal I know of, and its movement was somewhat erratic, It would seemingly be frozen and then quickly jump and then hover between the trees. It quickly left, and we were all left pretty stunned, but no one there couldn't come up with any explanation other than maybe having drank too much. The whole thing lasted about 3 to 5 minutes. An odd detail I remember is that the object seemed to be generally heading north. A few months later, I left Connecticut and had almost forgotten about that incident for over a year afterwards. Then I moved into a new apartment. The day we moved in, I was standing outside in the backyard with my best friend and our dogs. It was daytime. The yard was flat with a high fence. Things were calm and normal until all of a sudden the dogs started barking at something by the back fence, which was weird because they were not easily spooked and only really barked at something threatening. My friend and I looked up and saw the black spot thing, as I have come to call it, heading north above the fence line, but below the telephone lines. I had to ask my friend to describe it to me because I had to be sure I wasn't just lucid in my mind, because the way it made me feel and how it looked made me instantly remember the first time I saw it. I hadn't told this friend or anyone about the first experience of seeing it. The fact that it was in broad daylight made it even weirder and more credible for me. A few months later, the same friend and I were sitting in my car parked in a gallery space parking lot, and he was looking down at his phone. I happened to look up in my rear view mirror and saw it again, going north. Without even looking up from his phone, my friend asked me if I'd just seen it. I said, "Yeah, how the hell did you know?" And he said that he felt it. I have heard some podcasts talk about something similar, and sometimes I wonder if it is connected to shapeshifters. I will add to this if I see it again. It's been a couple years since the last time, but I don't think that will be the last time.
Now remember, keep your lights on and your doors locked. Then subscribe for more horrifying true stories.